The thunder crashed against the thin walls of Nora Blackwood's cabin like a volley of gunshots, making her flinch as she huddled in the corner of her bedroom, clutching her father's old pocket watch to her chest. Tonight marked 1 week since she'd buried him, and the emptiness of the remote Montana homestead pressed in around her like a physical weight, heavier than the storm that raged outside her window in the spring of 1875. Tears streamed down her face as another crash of thunder shook the cabin, rattling the windows in their frames. She was completely alone now, 23 years old, and stranded in the wilderness with only her grief for company. Her father had been everything: her family, her teacher, her protector. Now he was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through like wildfire, and she was left with nothing but a ramshackle cabin, dwindling supplies, and no idea how to survive the harsh frontier life without him. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and rain pounded against the roof so fiercely that Nora feared it might cave in entirely. The lantern on her bedside table flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. She wondered how much kerosene remained, one more resource she'd need to learn to manage. Another boom of thunder, closer this time, and Nora's sobs intensified. Her father had always been there during storms, his calm voice telling her stories to drown out the noise, his steady presence a shield against her fears. Now there was only the terrifying cacophony of nature's fury and her own ragged breathing. Then, barely audible above the storm, came a different sound: 3 firm knocks on her front door. Nora froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one came out this way, especially not in weather like this. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and her closest neighbor was the Wilkerson family, a good 5 miles down the valley. Her father's rifle was propped in the corner of her room, and she stumbled toward it, her trembling hands making it difficult to grip the wooden stock. 3 more knocks, louder this time. "Hello," a deep voice called out. "Anyone in there?" Nora picked up the rifle, checking that it was loaded as her father had taught her. With the weapon clutched tightly in her hands, she made her way through the small cabin to the front door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking. "Name's Reed Calloway, madam. I was passing through when the storm hit. Saw your light. My horse is about done in, and I'm not much better. Could use a place to wait out the worst of it." Nora hesitated, her finger hovering near the trigger. Her father had always been wary of strangers, but he'd also taught her about frontier hospitality. Refusing shelter during a storm like this could be a death sentence. Another crash of thunder made her decision for her. She couldn't bear to have another death on her conscience. "I'm armed," she warned, sliding back the bolt on the door with one hand while keeping the rifle aimed. "Wouldn't expect anything less, madam." She pulled the door open a crack, and wind immediately forced it wider, nearly knocking her off her feet. Through the rain and darkness, she could make out the silhouette of a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, water pouring off him in rivulets. Behind him, barely visible, was the shape of a horse, head hanging low against the storm. The man made no move to enter, respecting the rifle barrel pointed at his chest. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face for a brief moment, strong-jawed, weathered by sun and wind, with eyes that held no obvious malice, just weariness and the sharp alertness of someone accustomed to danger. "You're safe now," he said, his voice carrying over the howl of the wind. "I mean no harm, just need shelter till this passes." Something in his steady gaze made Nora lower the rifle slightly. "Tie your horse under the lean-to around back," she instructed. "There's a water trough. Come in through the back door after." The man Reed nodded once and disappeared into the darkness. Nora closed the front door, her heart still racing as she moved to the back of the cabin, lighting another lantern along the way. Through the small window by the back door, she watched as he led his horse, a sturdy chestnut, under the sheltered area where her father had kept their own horses before selling them last winter when money grew tight. Reed moved with the efficiency of someone familiar with animals and bad weather, quickly removing the saddle and rubbing down the horse with handfuls of straw he found stacked nearby. He pulled a blanket from his saddlebags and threw it over the animal before gathering his belongings and making his way to the back door. Nora opened it before he could knock, rifle still in hand but pointed at the floor now. "Thank you kindly," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. Water pooled around his boots on the plank floor. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with dark hair plastered to his head from the rain and a few days' worth of stubble on his jaw. "You can hang your coat there," she said, gesturing to a peg on the wall while maintaining her distance. Reed nodded, shrugging off his dripping duster and hanging it carefully. Underneath, he wore a simple cotton shirt, a leather vest, and worn denim pants, the practical clothing of a working cowboy. A holstered revolver was visible at his hip, but he made no move toward it. "Been riding long?" Nora asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear and grief still churning inside her. "Since dawn," he replied, his eyes taking in the small kitchen where they stood, the cast iron stove, the rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, the shelves with dwindling supplies. "Was hoping to make it to Willow Creek before the storm hit, but the trail got washed out about 3 miles back." His gaze settled on her face, noticing her red-rimmed eyes and tear-stained cheeks. "Are you all right, madam?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid her. Nora looked away, blinking rapidly to hold back a fresh wave of tears. "I'm fine," she said, then cleared her throat. "There's coffee in the pot if you want some. It's probably cold by now, but the stove's still warm enough to heat it." Reed didn't move toward the stove. "You've been crying," he observed quietly. "If I'm intruding on a private moment, I can try to make it to the next homestead." "In this storm," Nora shook her head, "there's no next homestead for miles, and you'd likely drown before you found it." She set the rifle down, leaning it against the wall within easy reach. "My father died last week. Fever took him. I buried him myself." The words came out flat, emotionless, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the devastation of her entire world. Reed removed his hat, holding it respectfully against his chest. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam. That's a heavy burden to bear alone." Nora nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Another thunderclap shook the cabin, and she flinched involuntarily. "Why don't you sit down?" Reed suggested gently. "I'll see about that coffee if you don't mind." He moved slowly toward the stove, telegraph his movements as if dealing with a spooked horse. Nora sank into one of the chairs at the table, suddenly exhausted. She watched as Reed added wood to the stove, stoked the embers, and set the coffee pot over the heat. His movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting he'd spent time making do in rustic conditions. Despite her wariness, she found his presence oddly comforting, a human connection after days of desolate solitude. "You said your name is Reed Calloway?" she asked after a few moments. He nodded, keeping his attention on the stove. "Yes, madam, and you are Nora Blackwood." "Miss Blackwood." He inclined his head respectfully. "Your father's place, I take it?" "Yes, he built it when I was 12. We came west from Illinois after my mother died." The memories flooded back her father's determination to start fresh, the long journey west, the grueling work of building their home in this beautiful but unforgiving landscape. "He was a good man, strong, I never thought." Her voice broke. Reed remained silent, giving her space to collect herself as he poured the reheated coffee into 2 mugs he found on a shelf. He set one before her and took the other chair, keeping a respectful distance. "Fever's a bad way to go," he said finally. "Lost my own father to it when I was 17. Nora looked up, studying his face. There was no pity there, just quiet understanding. "What did you do? After, I mean. Only thing I could do, buried him, sold what I couldn't carry, and moved on." He took a sip of coffee. "Had to make my own way after that. Worked cattle drives, broke horses, did some scouting for the army." His shoulders lifted in a slight shrug. "Found I was good at moving around, not so good at staying put." "I don't have that luxury," Nora said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "This place is all I have left." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small cabin, a strange calm had settled. There was something about sharing her grief with this stranger that made it marginally easier to bear, like dividing a load that had been crushing her. "Do you have family nearby?" Reed asked. "Anyone who could help," Nora shook her head. "No one. My father was private, kept to himself mostly." She didn't mention how his bitterness after her mother's death had slowly turned him away from others, making him suspicious and solitary. "There are neighbors down the valley, but we haven't had much dealing with them." Reed nodded thoughtfully. "And what will you do now? Running a homestead alone isn't easy." "I don't know," she admitted, the words catching in her throat. It was the question that had been tormenting her all week, the seemingly insurmountable challenge of survival without her father's strength and knowledge. "I know how to garden, and I can cook and sew, but the hunting, the heavy work." She gestured helplessly. "Father sold the horses last winter. There's just the milk cow and some chickens now. No other options, no relatives back east who might take you in, none that would want me." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. "My mother's family disowned her when she married my father and his family." She shrugged. "I never knew them." Lightning flashed again, followed almost immediately by a thunderclap that rattled the dishes on the shelves. The storm was directly overhead now. Reed set down his mug and rose. "I should check on my horse, make sure the lean-to is holding." Nora stood as well. "I'll come with you, the back corner sometimes leaks." He looked like he might object, but instead nodded. "Stay close. It's fierce out there." They donned rain gear, Nora in her father's old slicker that swallowed her small frame, Reed in his still damp duster, and ventured out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked Nora off her feet as they stepped outside, but Reed's steadying hand at her elbow kept her upright. The short dash to the lean-to left them both drenched despite their coverings. Reed's horse nickered softly when they entered, stomping nervously at the thunder. The shelter was holding, though water dripped through in places where the roof had weathered over the years. "Easy, Jupiter," Reed murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "Just a storm." Nora watched him with the animal, noting the gentle way he handled the nervous creature. Her father had been good with horses too, but with a firm hand rather than Reed's quiet reassurance. "He's beautiful," she said, approaching carefully and extending her hand for the horse to sniff. "Arabian?" Reed looked surprised. "Quarter horse mostly, but yes, some Arabian blood." "You know horses?" "My father bred them before." She trailed off, not wanting to explain the series of misfortunes that had forced them to sell off the small herd that had once been their pride. "I miss having them around." The horse nuzzled her hand, and Nora felt a smile tugging at her lips for the first time in days. "Hello, Jupiter," she said softly. "Quite a name for such a gentle soul. Don't let him fool you. He's got spirit when he needs it." Reed moved around the lean-to, checking the roof. "You're right about that back corner. Might be able to patch it tomorrow if the rain lets up." Nora watched him work, suddenly aware of how easily he had slipped into the role of helper, of protector. It had been only an hour since he'd knocked on her door, yet already his presence made the homestead feel less empty, less hopeless. They returned to the cabin as the storm intensified, thunder and lightning playing a terrifying duet above them. Inside, Reed built up the fire while Nora found dry clothes, another of her father's shirts, far too large but clean for him to change into while his own dried by the stove. As the night deepened, they sat at the table sharing a simple meal of cornbread and beans that Nora warmed up. The conversation flowed more easily now, moving from practical matters of the homestead to Reed's travels across the Western Territories. "I've been all over," he told her, "from Texas to Montana, California to Kansas. Never found a place that felt like putting down roots." "And what brings you to this part of Montana?" Nora asked. A shadow crossed his face. "Looking for work, mainly. Heard there was a ranch near Willow Creek hiring experienced hands." Nora sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Everyone on the frontier had their secrets, their reasons for being where they were. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for there." Reed's eyes met hers across the table. "Thank you for the shelter tonight, Miss Blackwood. Not everyone would open their door to a stranger in these parts." "Nora," she corrected him. "And you're welcome." She hesitated. "I'm glad you came along when you did. The storm and being alone after everything, it was too much tonight." Understanding passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement of human connection in a place where isolation was the norm. For the first time since her father's death, Nora didn't feel completely adrift. As the night wore on, the storm gradually began to subside, the spaces between thunderclaps growing longer. the rain settling into a steady rhythm rather than the earlier deluge. Nora prepared a makeshift bed for Reed on the floor near the stove, using quilts and a straw-filled mattress her father had sometimes used for overnight guests in better days. "It's not much," she apologized, "but it's dry." "It's more than I expected when I was riding through that storm," Reed assured her. "Thank you." Nora retreated to her bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar in case the storm picked up again. For the first time in a week, she fell asleep without crying, the sound of rain on the roof and the knowledge of another human presence nearby providing comfort enough to let exhaustion take her. Morning brought clear skies and birdsong, the storm having cleared the air to a crystalline brightness that hurt Nora's eyes when she first stepped outside. Reed was already up, she discovered, having tended to Jupiter and begun repairs on the lean-to roof using materials he'd found in her father's old workshop. She watched him work for a moment, appreciating the strength in his shoulders as he hammered a patch into place before calling out to let him know breakfast was ready. They ate together in companionable silence eggs from her chickens, the last of the cornbread, and strong coffee. "I should get on my way," Reed said finally, though he made no immediate move to leave. "That ranch job won't wait forever." Nora nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. After just one night, the thought of returning to complete solitude was almost unbearable. "Of course." "You've been delayed enough." Reed studied her face. "Will you be all right here alone?" It was the question she'd been asking herself all week. "I don't have much choice," she replied honestly, "at least until I figure out what to do next." Reed was silent for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. Finally, he said, "I could stay a few days, help with repairs before I move on. That storm did some damage." Hope flared in Nora's chest, bright and unexpected. "I couldn't ask that of you. You didn't ask." "I offered," he gestured toward the window. "Your fence is down in the south corner. Roof needs patching in at least 3 places I can see from here, and that lean-to won't last another storm without proper repairs." Nora bit her lip. The offer was tempting more than tempting. The list of things needing attention around the homestead was overwhelming when faced alone. "I can't pay you," she admitted. "Money's tight right now. Room and board is payment enough," Reed said simply. "Been sleeping under the stars for weeks." A real bed and home-cooked meals sounds like fair trade for a few days' work. She should refuse. A single woman alone with a man she barely knew, it wasn't proper, but propriety seemed a distant concern compared to the very real challenges of maintaining the homestead. 3 days, she said finally, "if you're sure the ranch job will wait." Reed's smile transformed his face, softening the weathered lines and lighting his eyes. 3 days it is, and don't worry about the job. If it's filled, there's always another." Those 3 days stretched into a week, and then 2, as Reed tackled one repair after another around the homestead. He fixed fences, patched the roof, reinforced the lean-to, and split enough firewood to last well into the fall. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, talking about everything and nothing: his travels, her childhood in Illinois, books they'd read, dreams they'd harbored. Nora found herself looking forward to those conversations more than anything else. Reed was unlike any man she'd known: thoughtful, well-spoken despite his lack of formal education, and genuinely interested in her opinions. He never made her feel less for being a woman, never dismissed her ideas or concerns the way her father sometimes had. As they worked side by side in her vegetable garden on the 10th day, Nora finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "The ranch in Willow Creek, you never went to check on that job?" Reed's hands stilled in the soil. "No," he admitted, "I didn't." "Why not?" He sat back on his heels, wiping his brow with his forearm. "Truth is, I wasn't just passing through during that storm. I'd been watching your place for a couple of days." Nora frowned, her body tensing. "Watching me? Why, not like that," he said quickly, reading her alarm. "Your father hired me about a month ago in Willow Creek." "Hired you for what?" Nora's confusion deepened. Her father hadn't mentioned hiring anyone. Reed sighed, looking uncomfortable. "He was sick already, I think, though he hid it well, said he was worried about leaving his daughter alone. Paid me to check on the place, make sure you were all right if anything happened to him." Nora sat back, stunned. He knew he was dying. I think he suspected, at least. He made me promise not to tell you about our arrangement, said you were proud and wouldn't accept help if you knew. Reed looked apologetic. I was planning to just keep an eye on things from a distance, but when I saw the state of the place after that storm and you inside crying, I couldn't just ride away. Tears welled in Nora's eyes, but they weren't entirely from grief this time. Even in his final days, her father had been thinking of her, trying to protect her in the only way he could. How much did he pay you? Enough for a month of checking in, Reed said. That time's almost up. The implication hung in the air between them soon. Reed would have fulfilled his obligation and would move on. The thought made Nora's chest tighten painfully. And then what? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reed's eyes, warm and brown in the afternoon sunlight, held hers steadily. That depends on you, Nora, on me. I've grown. Fond of this place, of the work. He hesitated. Of you. Heat bloomed in Nora's cheeks. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd felt her own feelings shifting, evolving from gratitude to friendship to something deeper she hadn't allowed herself to name. Now, with Reed's quiet admission, she couldn't ignore the flutter in her chest whenever he was near. I've never been one for staying in one place, Reed continued, but lately I've been thinking it might not be so bad putting down roots if I had the right reason. Nora looked away, overwhelmed by the implications. Reed, you don't need to say anything now, he interrupted gently. Just think about it. I could stay on, help run the place. We work well together, don't we? They did. In just 2 weeks, they'd fallen into an easy rhythm, anticipating each other's needs, complementing each other's strengths. The homestead was already running more smoothly than it had in years. Yes, she admitted. We do, Reed smiled, returning to his work in the garden. Then that's enough for now. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one, Nora finally allowed herself to imagine a future with Reed by her side. Not as an employee or a temporary helper, but as something more permanent. The idea should have frightened her. She barely knew him, after all, but instead, it filled her with a sense of possibility that had been absent since her father's death. Tell me about your family, she said softly. You've mentioned your father, but what about your mother, siblings? Reed leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs out before him. Mother died when I was young, too young to remember her clearly. It was just my father and me until I was 17, no siblings. He was quiet for a moment. What about you? Any brothers or sisters? No, just me. Nora wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the evening chill. Mother had complications when I was born, couldn't have more children after. Reed nodded thoughtfully. Seems we're both used to being on our own. Yes, though I've never been completely alone until now. She turned to look at him, his profile silhouetted against the darkening sky. It's different than I expected, heavier somehow. Solitude can be that way, Reed agreed. Freeing at first, then gradually it becomes a weight all its own. They fell silent, the only sounds the creaking of their rocking chairs and the distant call of a whippoorwill. After a while, Reed spoke again. I was engaged once, back in Texas. The revelation surprised Nora. What happened? War happened. I joined up with the Confederacy, not because I believed in the cause, mind you, but because every other young man was going and it seemed the thing to do. Promised Alice I'd come back and marry her. His voice took on a distant quality. By the time I returned, she'd married a shopkeeper who'd stayed behind. Can't blame her. 3 years is a long time to wait, especially when letters were scarce. I'm sorry, Nora said softly. Reed shrugged. It was for the best. After what I'd seen in the war, I wasn't the same man who'd left. Couldn't settle down, couldn't stand being confined, took to drifting, working whatever jobs kept me moving. He glanced at her. Until now, that is. The implication wasn't lost on Nora. Something about this place, about her, had made him want to stay when nothing else had in nearly 15 years of wandering. My father used to say that home isn't a place, it's a feeling, she said. I never really understood what he meant until he was gone. Now I think maybe home is where you feel you belong, where you fit. Reed's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. And where do you feel you belong, Nora Blackwood? She didn't pull away. I'm still figuring that out. The next morning, Reed was gone before Nora woke, Jupiter missing from the lean-to. For one terrible moment, she thought he'd left for good without even saying goodbye. Then she noticed his saddlebag still hanging on the peg by the door, his spare shirt drying on the line outside. He returned around midday, Jupiter loaded down with supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, tools, even a bolt of pretty blue calico that made Nora gasp when he unwrapped it. "Where did all this come from?" she asked, running her fingers over the fabric. "Willow Creek," Reed said, unloading the rest of the supplies onto the kitchen table. "Thought we could use some provisions if I'm staying on. But the cost, consider it an investment in the homestead." He smiled at her expression. "Don't worry, I didn't spend your father's money on this. Had some saved from my last job breaking horses for an outfit in Wyoming." Nora felt a rush of emotion at his thoughtfulness. No one had brought her a gift, however practical, since her father had given her a pair of leather gloves 2 Christmases ago. "Thank you," she said simply. Knowing the words were inadequate, Reed nodded, suddenly looking nervous. "There's something else I need to tell you. While I was in town, I ran into Marshall Davis." Nora tensed. The Marshal had never been a friend to her father, always looking for reasons to claim they weren't fulfilling the homesteading requirements that would grant them full ownership of the land. "What did he want?" He asked about your father. "I told him about his passing." Reed's expression was serious. "Nora, there's a problem with the homestead claim. Your father had to file some final paperwork, and with him gone." Cold fear washed through her. "Are they going to take the land?" "Not if we can help it, but there are conditions." Reed sat down at the table, gesturing for her to join him. "The claim requires continuous residence and improvements. With your father gone, they could challenge your right to stay, unless—" "Unless what?" Reed looked uncomfortable. "Unless you're married. A widow can inherit a homestead claim through her husband, and a husband can file on behalf of his wife." Nora stared at him, comprehension dawning slowly. "Are you suggesting it would be a practical arrangement," Reed said quickly, "to protect the land? We get along well enough, and I'm willing to stay and work the place. You'd have security, and I'd have a home, over time, perhaps." He trailed off, looking uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. Nora's mind raced. Marriage to a man she'd known for barely 2 weeks. It was madness. And yet, the alternative was losing everything her father had worked for, everything she had left in the world. "I need time to think," she said finally. Reed nodded, rising from the table. "Of course, I didn't mean to rush you, just wanted you to know where things stand." He headed for the door. "I'll be out fixing that north pasture fence if you need me." Alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the supplies Reed had brought, tangible evidence of his commitment to staying, Nora tried to sort through her tumultuous feelings. Marriage should be about love, about choosing a life partner with careful consideration. Her parents had married for love against her mother's family's wishes, and despite the hardships they'd faced, they'd been happy together. Could she find that kind of happiness with Reed? There was attraction there, certainly. Respect had grown between them, perhaps even the beginnings of deeper feelings. But marriage— Nora spent the afternoon in a daze, mechanically completing her chores while her mind circled the problem from every angle. By evening, when Reed returned from his work on the fence, she still hadn't reached a decision. They ate dinner in relative silence, the usual easy conversation replaced by a tension that stretched between them like a taut wire. After they'd cleared the dishes, Reed took his hat from the peg by the door. "Think I'll check on Jupiter before turning in," he said, clearly giving her space. "Reed, wait." Nora stood, hands twisting nervously in her apron. "About what you said earlier, you don't need to decide now," he interrupted gently. "It was a lot to spring on you. I shouldn't have—" "Yes," Reed blinked. "Yes, I'll marry you." The words came out in a rush, surprising even her. "For the homestead, I mean. As a practical arrangement, like you said." A complex mixture of emotions crossed Reed's face: relief, happiness, and something that might have been disappointment at her qualification about practicality. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel forced into this." "I'm sure." And she was, Nora realized. Whatever her confused feelings for Reed, she knew he was a good man, honest and hardworking. They could build a partnership, if not a love match. "When should we do it?" The Marshal said he'd be reviewing claims at the end of the month. "We should be married before then." Reed hesitated. There's a traveling preacher comes through Willow Creek every other Sunday. That would be this weekend. This Sunday, Nora echoed faintly. 3 days away. That's soon. Reed studied her face. Too soon, was it? The alternative was waiting, possibly losing the land, definitely continuing to live in this strange limbo with Reed where they were neither employer and employee nor quite friends nor openly acknowledging the attraction that simmered between them. No, she decided. Not too soon. Sunday it is. Reed's smile was tentative but warm. We'll ride into town together then, make it official. That night, lying in her bed, Nora tried to imagine what married life with Reed would be like. Would they continue as they had been, working side by side during the day, conversing on the porch in the evenings? Or would marriage change things between them, introducing expectations and intimacies she wasn't sure she was ready for? Reed had said it was a practical arrangement, but the way he looked at her sometimes suggested he wanted more. And if she was honest with herself, perhaps she did too. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for a wedding, though Nora tried not to read too much into that. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue cotton that had belonged to her mother, with the cameo brooch that was her only inheritance. Her hair, usually braided for practicality, she left loose around her shoulders, the honey-brown waves falling to the middle of her back. When she emerged from her bedroom, Reed was waiting by the front door, dressed in clean denims and a white shirt she'd never seen before, his dark hair slicked back with water. He stared at her for a long moment, something like awe in his expression. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Nora felt a blush creeping up her neck. "Thank you. You look nice too." They rode to town together, Nora on her father's old mule that Reed had found wandering in the south pasture a few days earlier. The journey passed mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the step they were about to take. Willow Creek was a small settlement, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of other businesses clustered around a dusty main street. The preacher had set up in the small schoolhouse, performing baptisms, marriages, and Sunday services for those settlers who couldn't make the longer journey to the established church in the larger town 30 miles east. The ceremony itself was brief and simple. There were no guests, no celebration, just Nora and Reed exchanging vows before the preacher, with the store owner and his wife serving as witnesses. Nora repeated the promises in a clear voice, trying to invest them with sincerity despite the unusual circumstances. When Reed slid a simple gold band onto her finger, another surprise he must have purchased during his trip to town, the weight of it felt strange but not unwelcome. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced when the vows were complete. Reed hesitated, his eyes searching Nora's for permission. She gave a slight nod, her heart hammering in her chest. His lips brushed hers gently, a whisper of a kiss that ended almost before it began, yet still left her feeling strangely breathless. And just like that, she was Nora Calloway, a married woman. They spent a few hours in town, filing the necessary paperwork with the marshal's office and purchasing a few more supplies before beginning the journey home. The ride back was different somehow, the silence between them charged with new awareness. As they approached the homestead in the golden light of late afternoon, Reed suddenly reined in Jupiter. "Wait," he said, dismounting and coming to help Nora down from her mule. "There's a tradition to uphold." Before she could ask what he meant, he'd swept her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. "A bride should be carried over the threshold of her new home," he explained, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Reed, this is silly." "I've lived here for years, humor me," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's not every day a man gets married." Nora relented, allowing him to carry her up the porch steps and through the front door of the cabin. Inside, he set her gently on her feet but didn't immediately step away, his hands lingering at her waist. "Welcome home, Mrs. Calloway," he said softly. The name sent a shiver through her. Mrs. Calloway, a married woman, Reed's wife. "Thank you for doing this," she said, needing to fill the charged silence. "For helping save the homestead." Something flickered in Reed's eyes, disappointment again, but he masked it quickly with a smile. It's as much for me as for you. I meant what I said about wanting to put down roots. He stepped back then, giving her space. I'll see to the animals. You must be tired after the ride. As Reed moved away toward the door, Nora felt an inexplicable sense of loss. This was their wedding day, yet they were already falling back into the pattern of polite distance they'd established over the past weeks. Was that really what she wanted from this marriage, Reed? She called after him. When he turned, she crossed the room to him and before she could lose her nerve, rose on tiptoes to press her lips to his in a kiss that was firmer, more deliberate than the one they'd shared in the schoolhouse. He froze for a moment in surprise, then his arms came around her, pulling her closer as he responded to the kiss with a hunger that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, staring at each other in wonder. What was that for? Reed asked, his voice husky. Nora smiled, feeling more certain than she had in weeks. I just thought, if we're going to be married, we might as well be married in more than just name. Reed's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I'd like that very much, Nora Calloway. That night, for the first time, they shared the bedroom that had once been Nora's alone. There was awkwardness at first, both of them nervous despite their earlier kiss, but Reed was patient and gentle, and Nora found herself responding to his touches with an eagerness that surprised her. In the quiet darkness of the room where she'd cried alone during that terrible storm, they found a different kind of comfort in each other's arms, a beginning rather than an ending. The weeks that followed saw them settling into married life with an ease that belied the unconventional start to their relationship. Reed threw himself into the work of the homestead with renewed vigor, determined to make it prosper not just for the sake of the claim, but for their future together. He repaired the old wagon, making it possible to transport goods to town for sale. He helped Nora expand her garden, building a fence to keep out rabbits and deer. Together, they cleaned out the old barn, making plans to acquire new horses when finances allowed. Nora, for her part, found herself blossoming under Reed's steady affection. The grief over her father's death didn't disappear, but it softened, becoming just one thread in the tapestry of her life rather than the dominant color. She began to look forward rather than back, making plans for improvements to the cabin, learning to ride Jupiter when Reed taught her, even talking about children someday when they were more established. Their evenings on the porch continued, but now they sat closer, often hand in hand, sharing stories and dreams with increasing openness. Nora learned about Reed's time in the war, the nightmares that still occasionally plagued him, the guilt he carried for actions taken in the name of survival. Reed came to understand the complex relationship Nora had had with her father, loving but sometimes difficult, shadowed by his grief over her mother's death and his increasing isolation from society. He did the best he could, Nora said one evening as they watched a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and pink. He wasn't always easy to live with, especially in the later years, but he loved me in his way. I'm sure he did, Reed agreed, his arm around her shoulders. He made sure you'd be taken care of even after he was gone. Nora leaned her head against his shoulder. I'm not sure this is what he had in mind when he hired you to check on me, Reed chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her ear. Probably not. But I like to think he'd approve, seeing how things have turned out. I think he would, Nora said thoughtfully. He always said I needed someone as stubborn as I am. Stubborn, Reed feigned offense. I prefer determined. Nora laughed, tilting her face up for a kiss that Reed was happy to provide. These moments of easy affection had become natural between them, no longer requiring courage or deliberation. As summer turned to fall, their bond continued to strengthen. The marshal, satisfied with their marriage and the visible improvements to the homestead, confirmed their claim without further issue. With that worry behind them, they were free to focus on building their life together. The harvest was good that year, providing enough to see them through the winter with some left over to sell or trade in town. Reed's skills as a hunter kept their table supplied with fresh meat, and Nora's careful preserving ensured they'd have fruits and vegetables long after the garden stopped producing. They celebrated their first Christmas together simply but joyfully, exchanging modest gifts, a new knife for Reed, a pair of warm gloves for Nora, and sharing a special meal by candlelight. Reed had managed to find a small pine tree which they decorated with strings of dried berries and pine cones dipped in wax. It was nothing like the elaborate celebrations Nora remembered from her childhood in Illinois, but somehow it felt more meaningful, more genuine. Winter on the Montana frontier was harsh, with snowstorms that sometimes kept them housebound for days at a time. But Nora found she didn't mind the confinement when Reed was with her. They spent the long evenings reading aloud from the few books they owned, playing cards, or simply talking by the fire. At night, they kept each other warm in ways that had nothing to do with the blizzards raging outside. By spring, Nora had news that brought both joy and trepidation. She was expecting a child, due to arrive in late autumn. "A baby," Reed breathed when she told him, his hand covering hers on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." The wonder in his voice dispelled any lingering doubts Nora might have had about his feelings for her. This marriage, begun as a practical arrangement, had become something neither of them had dared to hope for: a true partnership, a deep love, a family. The pregnancy progressed normally through the summer months, though the Montana heat sometimes left Nora uncomfortable and fatigued. Reed took on more of the household chores as her condition advanced, insisting she rest during the hottest part of the day. His protectiveness might have chafed if it hadn't been so clearly born of love rather than a desire to control. In September, a letter arrived that threatened to disrupt their hard-won happiness. It was addressed to Reed, the handwriting feminine and elegant on the envelope. "It's from Alice," he said, his face unreadable as he scanned the contents. "My former fiancé." Nora sat heavily in a kitchen chair, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "What does she want?" Reed handed her the letter. "Her husband died last winter, influenza. She's asking if I'd consider coming back to Texas." Nora read the carefully worded plea with growing unease. Alice wrote of their past together, of the love they'd shared, of her belief that fate had given them a second chance. The final lines were the most direct. "I know you've never settled anywhere for long, Reed, but you could settle here with me where you once belonged. We could have the life we planned before the war took you away." "She doesn't know," Nora said quietly, setting the letter down. "About me." "About the baby?" Reed shook his head. "No, how could she? I haven't had contact with anyone from back home in years." A terrible thought occurred to Nora. "Are you considering it, going back?" "What?" Reed looked genuinely shocked. "Of course not. Nora, how could you think that?" "You loved her once," Nora said, hating the insecurity in her voice but unable to help it. Pregnancy had made her emotions unpredictable, fears surfacing that she'd thought long buried. "You said yourself you might have married her if things had been different." Reed knelt before her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Listen to me. Whatever I felt for Alice belongs to the past. It was the feeling of a boy who hadn't seen the world, hadn't known real hardship or real joy." His eyes held hers intently. "What I feel for you, Nora, it's deeper than anything I've ever known. You and this child we've made together, you're my home now, the only home I want." Tears welled in Nora's eyes, partly from relief, partly from the hormonal surge that seemed to accompany any strong emotion these days. "I'm sorry." "I don't know why I doubted. Don't apologize," Reed interrupted gently. "It was a fair question, but the answer is no, I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever." He sealed the promise with a kiss that left no room for doubt, and that night he held her especially close, his hand protectively cradling her rounded belly where their child grew. Reed wrote back to Alice the next day, a kind but firm letter explaining that he was happily married with a child on the way, that his life was in Montana now, and that he wished her well in rebuilding her own. Nora read it before he sealed it, her heart full at the honest emotion he expressed about their life together. The incident, brief as it was, seemed to strengthen rather than weaken their bond. Perhaps it was the acknowledgement that choices had been made, paths committed to, that allowed them both to move forward with renewed certainty. In late October, as the aspens turned golden and the nights grew crisp, Nora went into labor. It was a difficult birth, long and painful, with moments when Reed feared for both his wife and child. He had sent for the midwife from Willow Creek at the first signs of labor, and the older woman's steady presence was a comfort during the grueling hours that followed. "Keep breathing, Mrs. Calloway," the midwife encouraged as another contraction gripped Nora. "Your baby's almost here." Reed held Nora's hand, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring encouragement even as his own heart raced with fear. He had faced gunfights and stampedes with less trepidation than he felt watching his wife struggle to bring their child into the world. Finally, as dawn was breaking on the second day, their daughter was born small but healthy, with a powerful set of lungs that announced her arrival to the world. The midwife cleaned and swaddled her before placing her in Nora's exhausted arms. "She's perfect," Nora whispered, tears streaming down her face as she counted tiny fingers and toes. "Look what we made, Reed." Reed couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He had never seen anything so miraculous as this tiny person who somehow combined the best of both of them: Nora's delicate features, his dark hair. He reached out a tentative finger, which the baby promptly grasped with surprising strength. "What shall we call her?" he asked when he could finally find his voice. Nora studied their daughter's face. "Rose," she decided. "Rose Ann Calloway." "Rose," Reed echoed, testing the name. "It's beautiful, like her mother." The midwife stayed another day to make sure both mother and baby were doing well, then left them to begin their life as a family of 3. The adjustment wasn't always easy. There were sleepless nights, moments of anxiety when Rose cried and they couldn't immediately determine why, the physical recovery Nora needed after the difficult birth. But there were also moments of such transcendent joy that Reed sometimes had to remind himself that this was real, that this was his life now, watching Nora nurse their daughter by firelight, holding Rose against his chest as he rocked her to sleep. The 3 of them cuddled together in the big bed as snow fell softly outside. By the time winter had settled in earnest over the Montana landscape, they had found their rhythm as parents. Reed took on more of the outdoor chores, keeping the paths clear of snow, making sure the animals were warm and fed, venturing into town when supplies were needed. Nora focused on caring for Rose and maintaining the household, though she insisted on helping with the outdoor work when the weather allowed. Rose bundled against her chest in a sling Reed had fashioned from an old blanket. As Christmas approached again, marking nearly a year and a half since that stormy night when Reed had first knocked on Nora's door, they found themselves reflecting on how much had changed. "If you had told me then that we'd be here now, married, with a beautiful daughter, I wouldn't have believed it," Nora said as they sat by the fire one evening, Rose sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby. Reed smiled, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "I knew from that first night that you were special, Nora. I just didn't know how completely you would change my life. For the better, I hope," she teased, though her eyes were serious in every way. Reed's gaze moved from his wife to his sleeping daughter and back again. "You know, when I was riding through that storm, I almost passed by, thought maybe it would be better to find shelter under a rock ledge I'd seen a mile back, but something made me keep going until I saw your light." "Fate," Nora suggested, "or my father's planning. Either way, I'm grateful." Reed pulled her closer into the circle of his arms. "You saved me as much as I saved you that night." Nora rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "We saved each other." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent in the darkness. But inside the cabin that had once echoed with Nora's lonely tears, there was warmth and light and the quiet breathing of a family at peace. Years later, when Rose was 5 and joined by a little brother named James, she would ask her parents to tell the story of how they met. It became a family favorite, recounted on birthdays and anniversaries, embellished slightly with each telling but always ending the same way. "Your mother was crying in the night storm," Reed would say, his arm around Nora's shoulders, until a cowboy knocked and said, "You're safe now," Nora would finish, her eyes meeting his with a love that had only deepened with time, and she was. They all were, safe and home at last.